Welcome to the Score podcast.
According to Forbes Advisory, 43% of consumers say they use artificial intelligence to answer financial questions. According to the World Economic Forum, 85% of financial services organizations are using AI. So, who's training who here? I'm Jeff Richardson, host of the Score podcast. Attend any conference in the financial services industry and literally part of every panel, keynote, and coffee break conversation, the topic of AI and generative AI will come up. With such a focus and so much at stake, having the right legal experts focused on using AI properly and safely is critical to all of our futures. That's one of the reasons I'm thrilled to be speaking today to our own legal expert, Tamra Moore, who recently joined VantageScore as Deputy General Counsel. Tamra is an attorney with over 15 years of in-house and federal government litigation, investigation, and regulatory counseling experience. Most recently, she was an in-house counsel at a global financial services company where she advised the chief data officer and others on legal and regulatory compliance related to the development and use of artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies in consumer-facing products and internal operations. Earlier in her career, she was senior counsel in the United States Department of Justice's Civil Division, where she represented the Office of the President, federal agencies, and officials in constitutional and administrative law challenges to nationally significant federal policies and programs. Tamra is one of only a handful of lawyers in this country with a visible external profile and training as a thought leader on legal issues associated with the use of AI and machine learning in regulated industries, and that's why I'm thrilled to be speaking with her today. Tamra, thank you so much for joining the Score podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, as it relates to using AI and generative AI, what types of intellectual property issues arise, and how can FinTech firms and companies like ours harness these powers, but also protect our innovation?
AI and generative AI raise really interesting intellectual property issues by virtue of how models are trained, which is on data. For example, AI and generative AI generate outputs. Do existing IP laws apply to AI and generative AI outputs? Can an algorithm or model be an author or innovator under IP laws? And if the answer to that question is no, what is the degree of human involvement needed to be covered under IP laws? Training models also raise data ownership questions. For example, in the generative AI context, who owns the output of an AI model that has been trained on both the vendor's own data and the acquiring company's data? In my view, the best way that companies can protect themselves is through robust due diligence of their vendors. This would entail, for example, understanding how your vendor's models were trained and on what. I think it's also important to establish policies and procedures governing your internal use of AI and training your employees about the risks posed by entering personally identifiable information or confidential business or trade secret information into models owned by a third-party vendor. And FinTech companies can also protect themselves through robust licensing terms by putting in place strong indemnification and other protective contractual provisions. It's also important to have clear terms governing the licensor's ownership of the data and the licensee's permitted use of the data.
Thanks for that, Tamra. Where I'd head next is kind of in the fair lending area. I mentioned it during the intro. So in financial services, we are particularly focused on fair lending and at VantageScore. One of our key tenets is financial inclusion. And at least hypothetically, AI has the potential to advance these goals. But you see reports out there on these types of technologies actually introducing bias. So how do we as a company approach governance and stewardship in this area of fair lending?
I think that companies like ours and other FinTech companies must approach governance and stewardship by centering the consumer experience from the moment of design to development through deployment and post-deployment models. For example, if you look at various different AI governance frameworks such as NIST's AI Risk Management Framework, the Organization for Economic Cooperation for Development, OECD's AI principles, and others, there are common themes among all of these AI governance frameworks, which center on ensuring that AI does not harm individuals. These frameworks focus on respecting and promoting human rights, for example, right to privacy, harm minimization principles, etc. Some of these frameworks recommend that companies actively consider and document how they use AI and how their use of AI may impact consumers. One way to keep the consumer at the focus of your design and development is by creating cross-functional and diverse teams with individuals who have different but relevant areas of expertise. And all of that together will hopefully help mitigate the risk of bias in our models.
That's interesting. And I guess it speaks to the importance of living and breathing diversity, both in terms of sort of what you want your model to accomplish, but also in your own workforce. Relatedly, so transparency and explainability are critical for credit scoring models. We are known for advancing that effort through our reason codes. It's basically a prerequisite for launching a model to have the model be explained to consumers. So if models are actually training themselves, that becomes a massive challenge. So what are regulators looking for as it relates to consumer transparency in these AI-driven models?
I think that VantageScore does an excellent job of this. Regulators like the FTC want companies to be honest and transparent about how they collect and use consumer data and to not overstate what services an AI product may provide. Or, for example, the inverse of that, regulators like the FTC and CFPB become concerned when companies fail to fully disclose how a model uses consumer data and how it renders decisions. The CFPB, for example, has issued guidance governing the use of AI in issuing credit denials, which requires lenders to provide specific details about why a consumer may have received an adverse action beyond generally broad categories like, quote, purchasing history. I think that what you see from regulators is the importance, again, of keeping the consumer centered in your product development and ensuring that you're transparent about how you use and collect their data and explaining how your use of AI may impact them or not.
So I guess along the same thread, one thing that is commonly referenced and said, maybe around the water cooler, is that technology advances faster than regulation, and regulation is always sort of chasing to keep up. Is that the case with AI, or are the rules of the road keeping pace with the innovation?
I think that there's some truth to the idea that laws are not keeping up with innovation. For example, earlier I mentioned some of the outstanding and novel legal issues raised by AI in the area of intellectual property law. So that's one example of how our laws may not be keeping up with innovation. On the other hand, there are plenty of existing federal and state laws that provide guardrails for the development and use of AI. There's federal laws such as federal anti-discrimination laws, and states have been very active in proposing their own legislation to establish guardrails for the use of AI within their own state boundaries. And so I think that to bring it full circle, it is both that sometimes the laws don't keep up with innovation, but we also have laws that we can apply, or that regulators and lawmakers will apply to our use of AI in the consumer area.
That's really interesting, Tamra. And just to sort of unpack what you said also, we've got laws, fair lending laws, explainability laws that maybe weren't enacted specifically for AI, but we need to bear those rules in mind as we go down this path. And that's going to be beneficial to the end consumer. Thanks, Tamra. And it sort of feels like you've been with VantageScore a long time already, because, it's only been a few weeks, but you and I have certainly had a lot of meetings and everything together. But this is your first appearance on the score, and I hope it's not the last one.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to be at VantageScore and to have had the opportunity to present here on the score.
The pleasure's ours. According to consulting giant McKinsey, one of the key ways that banks will deploy AI is in risk management, specifically managing value at risk by strategically lowering financial risk. This priority includes identifying which intervention is needed and when for each customer based on their circumstances and ability to pay. So just to translate, if banks can reduce risk and losses, they can actually offer loans to consumers more affordably. And we're all for that here at VantageScore. I'm Jeff Richardson, and I look forward to our next conversation.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of VantageScore Solutions. Visit VantageScore.com to learn more.